Welcome to India Lost and Found. I am Amit Pasricha. I am the founder of India Lost and Found. But let me start off by telling you how I began India Lost and Found, because that story will help you understand what is it that we are attempting to do. I've been a photographer for over 30 years, and I've done a series of commercial projects, maybe about 20 odd books on India, and I'm also regarded as the panoramic photographer of the country, because about 10 years ago I adopted that format, or 15 years ago, and I did a series of books in that format as well. And a large number of the projects that I did were to do with architecture. So other than architect projects, a lot to do with the heritage of India. And when my last book came out, which was India at Home, which was it wasn't really historic houses, but as much as a mixture of eclectic homes across the country, I sort of closed shop on making books, partly because the audience for books is sort of diminished, but also because I thought that here I was with the command of a beautiful language, the language of photography, which is an incredible language, and I could then use it to actually make a difference in the space of our society. So I sort of thought about what is it that I could do. One of the areas that I looked at was heritage, which is which I'd photographed a lot of, and so I thought that is it something that I can do to actually add value to the way we regarded heritage. Now, in the course of my last few books, I kind of recognized that really the problem area was local people's relationship with local heritage. I mean, it was really abysmal. They treated it like a dump yard, especially in towns and villages. And so when you went there, it was really totally mistreated and miskept. And I said, okay, if I was going to make a difference at that ground level, what do I need to do? And one of the things I thought that I could do was arm youngsters with interesting knowledge and have them go across to these sites. So when, let's say, when they visited Khajuraho temple, then they would stop on the way and visit 4 lesser known sites along the way, and then perhaps in that little chai shop engagement that happened with the local people, some amount of enthusiasm would be transmitted. Now, even if it wasn't to that level, at the base level, I thought what could happen is that the people would begin to question, why have this or these youngsters arrived from 500 kilometers away to see something that I am treating so badly. In that little questioning, something new might begin. Now, I also realized that while photography itself was a great language, there was a limitation with photography, because having started off as a medium of telling the truth, that's when it displaced painting as a truth medium. It sort of lived its life out and became more a medium of self-expression. And ironically, in our age, I could show you a picture of a devastation. So I could show you a picture of a tsunami wave, and you could kind of look at it maybe in an art gallery and say, what a lovely composition. So much so that it almost seemed like the subject matter of the picture was becoming irrelevant. And so I said, if this language was to hold any meaning, then it would need to be directed with thought. Now, what was this thought? So I said, okay, let me look at the definitions of heritage and let me see what I can see around. So I sort of looked around everywhere, and I realized a few things. I mean, one was that we did the obvious thing. We treated heritage as a historic building. And what do you do with historic buildings? You say this is firstly a building, so obviously architects can interpret this, and you say this is historic, so any history related field which would include archaeology, which would include conservation, would also become a part of this. So you handed it over to historians and to architects and asked them, please tell us what is it we are looking at, and they came out with their set of definitions. Now both of those fields are great in what they do, but they also have somewhat, in fact quite severe limitations to the way their interpretation goes. So I generally found that the architect, and this is a bit of a problem in our country, I don't know about the rest of the world actually, but the definition of that building for the architect, or even for that matter the architectural student, was something that was grounded in technicality. And so their definitions tended to become something like built in the Indo-Saracenic style with Doric columns and references to bulbous domes and acres of land and number of pillars, and unfortunately almost like their discourse was going out to another architect. So I said, now listen, this is not really a definition that is going to endear heritage to anybody other than an architect perhaps. I am not even sure about that. But let us look at what the historians are doing. So now the historian's definition is also rather curious, because when you examine some of the restrictions that are put into that box of history, then you see this one tall boundary that they built around that subject, and that boundary is the what I call the wall of authenticity, because they are kind of told that, look, if you can't authenticate something, then don't talk about it. And there's this sort of like a fetish with having a bibliography and reference. So I think a bunch of even oral histories become questionable from their standpoint, because I mean, who is that oral historian that's giving that tale? So when you think about this wall of authenticity and you really wonder what is within this wall and what's outside this wall, then two things you realize. One, what's within that wall amounts to more or less fact reporting. And why I would say fact reporting is because, I mean, a historian who's diving into reading inscriptions and into manuscripts is largely not going to come across material that is going to converse about sociological aspects and things like that, unless you chance upon some allegorical work or some traveler's account maybe, but those are likely to be few and far in between. And so generally what you'll have is rather fact based, fact reporting, if I was to call it. So the historians were largely doing fact reporting and the architects were largely doing a technical discourse, and those are the two people offering us insights into how we could connect with that historic site. Now I for one would like to connect with a site on a people basis, on this fact that given the example that many of us would at some point in our lives want to go and visit where our grandfather lived, and it's not for the reason that because it was a building, but because of the fact that it was associated with me through my grandfather, and that association is what I realized would be the key point if we were going to create awareness from the point of view that people will want to protect this heritage. Ultimately, that's the key meaning of India Lost and Found, is to get there. Now going back to that history box, fact reporting inside that box. But what is outside that box? Outside that box lies culture, the nuances that build society. I mean, whether you call it, whether it's crafts or cuisines, or it's just the colors of that society, motives, designs, sociological factors, dresses, you name it. I mean, all that is sitting in zones which somewhere are being picked up by some set of people, definitely not the sociology box as much, but other groups of people who are sort of picking up, like the crafts person will know something about the crafts, but he may not be able to tack it back onto the dynasty or the people. So, having understood all this, what is the tack we took at India Lost and Found? And the tack was this, that actually what we were doing wrong was considering that we were looking at a historic building. What it wasn't that, it was instead a symbol. It was either a symbol of a person, or a symbol of a community, or a symbol of a king, or an era, or a dynasty, or even a geography for that matter. And if we allowed ourselves to look upon it as a symbol, then symbolically we could attach to it any thought that had to do with that era or that dynasty or that person. And so, it wouldn't be wrong to say that you could be looking at a building and tasting the biryani, or smelling the roses, or viewing a Kohinoor diamond in your head, or understanding the nature of how the women of a certain dynasty were empowered, or so many factors. And all, of course, the arts and all the oral traditions, which and poetry and all those other aspects which would lend themselves to societies and cultures, drawing out the complexity of who they were, because ultimately what we eventually have done with all our history readings is to largely simplify, and simplify to such a degree that there are one-liners now describing people, and that doesn't do them justice. And my fear is that if we do it to generations in the past, it's very likely that this exactly will get done to us, and we will become a one-liner, and that one-liner could be the 21st century sitting on environmental disaster and happily living on their existence. So, it's possible, anything is possible. Anyway, the idea was to how we're doing it on our platform is by this complex fabric that we've built. It's almost like a umbrella network. So, that umbrella network is of a group of people that are called the thought experts, and those thought experts are going from the William Dalrymples and Leila Tyabji and Swapna Little and Giles Tillotson and Pushpesh Pant, all the way down to BA honors students. We have currently about 250 plus people who are engaged with India Lost and Found in a voluntary position to add thought value to the pictures that we post. The idea of all this, these thoughts that are being put out there, is to trigger people, is to make people thirst for more knowledge in a direction that they perhaps have not thought. So, let me give you 2 or 3 examples. One would be, let us say, Fatehpur Sikri. Most people would have visited Fatehpur Sikri, and most of those people would describe Fatehpur Sikri as a incredibly quirky complex built with red sandstone, with very quirky buildings, with a lot of sculpture, carving, and they would stop. I mean, for them that was the physicality of Fatehpur Sikri. how many of them would be able to actually smell the biryani like we talked earlier, or imagine the games that were played out in that court, the Batisi games or the elephants fights, or the other things that happened. And part of the problem is that people are not able to do that because they don't have cultural cues, and we haven't sort of bothered to go into that space. So, going back to the box, we have this history box, we have the sociology box, and we have the architecture box. But none of these really talk about historic culture, and that box unfortunately didn't get created. And that's the box that, because of the fact that it's missing, is leading to this deprivation of thought in our interpretation for our cultural built heritage. And that's the gap that ILF would like to bridge. So, these experts adding little thought from a whole canvas of liberal art positions, sociology, museums, crafts, cuisines, design, art, even motifs, so iconography or borrowed design, or aspects of geography, how things spread and how kingdoms moved, and so how even architecture was borrowed from one place to another, and so on and so forth. So, the idea is that when they create enough thought, that we can put this thought together to deliver for the lesser known monument something akin to, or something on the lines of what the experience center or the interpretation center of a Humayun's tomb or a Red Fort will deliver. So, what will happen in maybe the next 10 years is that the top 100 monuments of the country are going to have an interpretation center, and they are going to have augmented reality and virtual reality, which will allow people to imagine. So, but what of the lesser known monuments? How are we going to get people who visit these lesser known sites arrive there as if they have teleported in time? Because that's the way people are going to synergize with that space. And in order to do that, this construct that I am calling as a SiteLens is going to be the lesser known monuments delivery of this little packet of knowledge, maybe 5 minutes or less, that will now get the people thinking. So, imagine there are two situations here. One, let's talk about our visit to a Diwan-e-Aam or a Diwan-e-Khas. When we visit a Diwan-e-Aam or a Diwan-e-Khas, if we have seen Mughal-e-Azam, automatically it starts playing inside our head. We get our cues from it, we get the timbre of the voice of the king from it, we get chandeliers, drapery, carpets, the feeling of luxury, all, and the colors also from it. Now, that is a linear representation, and that is something that once you've watched it, it's sort of embedded inside you. What if instead of that we could give people little cultural cues so that they could use the creative centers within themselves to imagine? So, it's a bit like the book versus the movie, and generally as you will know, the book people prefer over its movie adaptation, and for the reason that it allows our creative centers to interact with its words and to imagine it, and that is a much more enriching experience for us. And so, similarly, if we could put that little knowledge in a way so that if there were 1 million people that visited a Diwan-e-Aam, then they could we could have a million stories, each one different, because now everyone can interpret that little material that we put out in a creative but interesting but different way than the others. Wouldn't that be so much more beautiful than that linear movie representation? Now, here's the rub. In order to be able to go into this space, what do we really need to do? Because let's think about it. If I came to you and I asked you to go and spend a month or two in a library, and I said to you, look, I want to do a book on this character in history. All right, please go to that library, spend a month or two, research, come up and give me all the cue points that you can give me so that I could visualize the movie. I'm not talking about the storyline. That's another aspect entirely. I'm talking about the very visualization, the what they wore, how they stood, what they did. Whatever you may dig out in as much time as you took, do you not believe that you would be less than even 10% of the visual elements that I would need to actually be able to do this? And so where would the rest of the 90% come from? Would it not spring from imagination? How would I know how really the clothes were worn, how really the armaments were held, how many steps in front or behind one character stood from another? How would I know cultural cues, social aspects? I wouldn't know any of these things, and so I would have to imagine it. Now, that's the trigger that we need, and we must use that trigger on India Lost and Found, which is to say, imbibe the knowledge, which is read up, go visit sites to get the cultural and the oral histories also in place, to interpret that material and to interpret it from a intelligent point of view of going beyond the very obvious, and then finally to imagine what is left out, because without that imagination component we are going to still left with fairly dry stuff. And while it may not sort of fit in with the way the historians would think about it, it would be a lot more palatable to an audience who is looking to establish a relationship, and that's what we are aiding in. It's that relationship with our heritage, if we are going to save it. Now, there are of course three nodal groups of people at play in all this. One of those nodes is of course the academia, and many of you are from that node, who have knowledge and who have have read up enough and are intelligent enough to sort of see aspects of history and read it. There's another group which is a reactionary group, and that group is of the heritage walk leader. Now, that heritage walk leader is kind of probably said, look, historians and architects, you know what you're turning out is a bit dry for me. I need to flesh this out a bit further. And so he or she has taken this and added flavor of culture and sort of dip that knowledge into a little more color, so to speak, to be able to now carry that to people who go on a heritage walk with them. And but the problem is that heritage walk leader is likely to be inside a city, is likely to only have a fixed number of monuments, and also has a very limited audience. Now, apart from these two, there is another node, and that node is a node that's looked down upon, and that node is the tour guide, the guy who stands outside a monument and comes running to your car when you arrive at the monument and says, come with me, and for this much, these little rupees, I will give you, I will describe what you are going to see here. And of course, he's likely to tell you a really fantastical story, which is not credible, And it's also possible that a large number of his clients actually perhaps don't even fully believe him. But not only does he have the maximum audience, he actually does the job of entertaining his clients. They go back with a story. I mean, I don't know how many of them argue that this is not correct or not. There is, so there are those three nodes, and why I'm laying out those nodes is because each group has something good to offer us. And so the position that we've taken vis-a-vis our SiteLens and even our cultural interpretation is pat in the middle of this triangle, which is to say, can we get the authentic information from our academia? Can we marry it with the zest and the culture driven style of the heritage walk leader? Can we mix that too and then create something in a story like fashion? Because that is what engages people, is this way of telling a story. And so if we were to sort of marry these three together, we should be able to create something of interest to a larger number of people than today. And so while this SiteLens is being tested currently, we are sort of figuring out modes of delivery of this information. So part of what we're considering is that this is going to be, we're going to test out in three different ways. One as written text, on the phone, scrollable text, running over an audio visual of images. The other model is of shorter audio files. So you have an audio visual of images and you click on buttons, and each button will deliver you interesting abstract in an interesting way. And the third method, which is even more exciting, is to deliver through two animated characters against the reality of photographs of the site, because we want to establish that whatever we are talking about actually has relevance to perhaps where you are, and or to a real place that exists, and having an intelligent short discourse on that site. So we're testing out these three different models to see, perhaps we need all of them for different groups of people, but we need definitely a large amount of information to be able to build a SiteLens. And this SiteLens we plan to sort of take across the country to many monuments and sort of develop a repository of these SiteLens. The idea would be develop them and then to spread that around in such a way that we are able to come at Google from many directions and to make Google intelligent. Now, how does the heritage map of India fit in with India Lost and Found? So, currently we began this process off in March this year. Initially, it was a social media challenge, and I was lucky enough to get Amitabh Bachchan to put out a video for the social media challenge, where we invited people to submit photographs and also rich thoughts on our heritage. But we got very scattered response, not from a single space, not comprehensive. And so as a result, we in July converted that into a volunteer program. So from July till today, we've sort of grown, and we are over 450 volunteers across 30 cities who are going around and photographing historic sites in their city. And next year, maybe towards the end of next year, we want to start putting out packets as we close each city data onto that heritage map to make an AI intelligent resource. Now, while the photography is of course going to be of a really optimal quality, and that's what we're ensuring through this campaign, the information that we put out, what is that going to be? And that's where we need a lot of help, because it's for some of those sites where we're able to build a SiteLens. We're going to put that SiteLens out, but there are going to be a large number of sites that do not have that level of information available, and so we are going to construct some level of a mini SiteLens. So what are we looking for? So there's a whole range of topics. Now, obviously we're not looking for just architecture and history, but all sorts of aspects that would relate to the site. So and that's where we need your help, is because these lists are humongous. Like Delhi is almost 1400 sites, Bombay is about 1000 sites, Jaipur is another 1400 sites, and we want to be able to put out not dry information. We'll put that out as well, but we'll also, what we want is the trigger information that's going to make people connect with the site. And while we'll figure out methods of how that content on the heritage map property is going to be delivered, we need pools and teams of people coming together across our cities to be able to create this content now for the heritage map. I mean, wherever, whoever takes part in this map project or in any project is always acknowledged on India Lost and Found, and so we will take that forward. That we want it to be understood that this is a crowd creative project, and you know, at the end of the day there's going to be thousands of people who are going to participate and help us create this content, and each one of us, of them, for us is actually the creative well that helped bring this entire thing together. There's an appeal that goes out to say that join us to help create this resource. We have also another set of challenges, which is other than the 30 cities that we're working in and a number of other cities that we are going to add on to this, we have a data crunch. We don't have listings of heritage sites that we can work with, and you know, ideologically I believe that wherever we do anything we must do it comprehensively, and so we are attempting to put together mini mapping teams who can town by town map those towns according to the definition that we've developed on India Lost and Found, and give us listings that the next team, which is the layer of photographers, can go out there and make beautiful pictures on, and the researchers go and add their interpretations on. So there's a lot to participate in and a lot to look forward to. Join us to create this, what could be perhaps one of the most talked about projects in the future, a heritage map of India. Thank you.